Hello, I'm Reverend Chris Eggert, co-founder and executive director of God Before Guns. God Before Guns is a multi-faith coalition of individuals and faith communities working to end gun violence. We do this work through community engagement and advocacy, and we collaborate with diverse faith communities and other community partners. Gun violence is about the sanctity of life, and we are working to help build a nation that will elevate that life above the fears that lead to a society being armed against itself. As part of our community engagement, we present to you today our latest in a series of courageous conversations. We began this series exactly 1 year ago today on Wear Orange Weekend. The Wear Orange movement started in honor of Hadiya Pendleton. Hadiya was a 15-year-old who lived on the south side of Chicago, and she was killed in a spray of gunfire as she and her friends were just hanging out in a park after taking their high school finals. Hadiya was killed just days after she participated with her marching band at President Obama's inauguration, so her killing made national news. Her friends wore orange to remember her and to raise awareness about gun violence. One of her friends was quoted as saying, "Orange is basically the color hunters wear to signal other hunters not to shoot them. So that's why we're wearing it, to say, don't shoot me." The color orange is now used as a symbol of anti-gun violence movements around the country. In Hadiya's memory, and to observe this year's Wear Orange, our special guest today is John Woodrow Cox, Washington Post staff writer and a finalist for the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing, for a portfolio of stories that presented the horror of gun violence from an entirely new perspective through the eyes of children. From those stories, John has written a newly published book titled Children Under Fire: An American Crisis. Children Under Fire was named by Publishers Weekly as one of the most anticipated books of the year. And on its cover, Dan Rather writes, "This deeply reported, impressive book is sure to be one of the most important books of the year." So I introduce to you now John Woodrow Cox, author of Children Under Fire: An American Crisis. Welcome, John. Thanks for taking the time to be here with us today as part of our Wear Orange Weekend.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. Congratulations on the well-deserved accolades about your book. I first listened to the book, and then as soon as I was finished listening, I bought a copy so I could have it. And I've been telling everyone about it, including our board of directors. And I think about a third of our board of directors now have finished the book. But I thought that rather than me just working through informally through my networks, it would be even better if you could agree to sit down with us for a few minutes and tell us about the book in your own voice and your own words. I guess I would start with, given that you began this reporting now more than a few years ago, and then wrote a book. You've been working on this for a few years now. Can you share with us a little about how the journey began or how your interest grew in the issue?
Sure. So I started reporting on this subject in early 2017. That was when I was launching off on this series for the Post about, really it was broader. The original idea was a little bit broader than kids and gun violence. It was just more broadly about kids and violence. And then very quickly, it became clear that this needed to be about the impact of gun violence on kids in America. the very first kid who I met was Tyshawn, who is one of the two central subjects in the book. And, it just became clear to me that our understanding as Americans of what gun violence is doing to kids in America is just incomplete, that we don't have a really good sense of the scope of this crisis or the depth of it either. We look so narrowly at the kids who get shot, the kids who die, but we almost always overlook the kids whose lives are impacted or devastated, even if they don't suffer any kind of physical harm. And so that's really that was the beginning, back in 2017. And the second story that I worked on was the one in Townville, where I met Ava, who is the other central subject of the book. So I've known them now for more than 4 years. It's really been a long time.
Absolutely, and it's not as if the issue has gone away since
Right.
you started the reporting. So it is as timely, if not even more timely now than it was when you started in 2017. We haven't given away, it's not a big reveal that the book is, much of the book is about Ava and Tyshawn as you follow their lives through a period of time. And I want to ask you about, about that relationship, about your relationship with them. And I thought maybe the best way to do that would be for you to read the beginning of that.
Sure. Yes, I'd be happy to. So this is these are the first few pages of the first chapter in the book. The boy had come to the end of another bad week, and now the girl he adored wanted to know how he was doing. He hated when people thought of him as a troublemaker, one of those kids who frustrated his teachers and disappointed his mother. But more and more often, he feared that's how they all felt. He had struggled to keep buried what was inside him, a swirling, combustible blend of emotion that the tiniest spark could ignite. It had started as disbelief, even denial, before turning into grief, and then at last this simmering rage that had clung to him for months. It had erupted again a few days prior, so the true answer to the girl's question would have been that he wasn't doing well, but the boy didn't want her to know the truth. Good, Tyshawn McFadder, age 9, told her instead as he stared through the screen of his mother's cell phone at Ava Olson, age 8. It was, for late spring, an unusually brisk afternoon in his neighborhood, just 15 minutes from the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Dressed in black sweatpants and a gray hoodie pulled low over his head, Tyshawn stood barefoot as he slumped over the side of an armchair in his mother's modest living room, the cell phone in one hand and a chocolate chip granola bar in the other. Ava, who was 520 miles away in South Carolina that afternoon, told him her week had been hard. Why, he asked. I've just been mad and sad and stuff, said Ava, her hair honey blonde, brown eyes serious, an accent tinged with the South. She wore a blue t-shirt and pink SpongeBob SquarePants bottoms as she sat atop her bed beside a half dozen animals and a fat brown cat named Charlie. Why, Tyshawn repeated between bites of the granola bar. Ava didn't know what to say. She also didn't want her friend to know the truth, both because it pained her to discuss it and because she dreaded what he might think of her if he knew. For 7 seconds, she didn't answer. I don't know, she said, then stopped and changed the subject. Ava had first heard about Tyshawn nearly a year earlier when she walked into her living room and noticed her mother, Mary, crying on the couch. Why are you upset? Asked Ava, who suspected that, yet again, she was why. No, Mary assured the girl, it wasn't her fault. Her mother explained that she had just read a story I'd written for the Washington Post about a child named Tyshawn who was a lot like Ava. The boy also felt angry and confused and unhappy sometimes because he, too, had lost someone he loved. His dad is where Jacob is, Mary said, and Ava understood. Mary hadn't let her read my story, but she showed her daughter pictures of Tyshawn, posing next to his dad and flashing the deuces sign in a family photo, playing with a toy alone on his father's couch, staring at a window, his dark eyes empty. The boy looked like he needed a friend, Ava announced, so she got a pencil and a sheet of paper and sat down at her kitchen table. Dear Tyshawn, she began to write in neat block letters. Before their lives came apart, the two kids had little in common other than their ages. Ava, who is white, was a Daisy Scout and wanted nothing more than to become a cheerleader. Day after day, she practiced cartwheels in the dirt and grass behind her home, which overlooked a neighbor's bucolic horse farm. She had lived almost all her life in Townville, the quiet 4,000-person swath of countryside in the northwest corner of South Carolina, known as the Upstate. Her dad had always worked in security or law enforcement, and he'd always carried a gun, which she never thought much about, if at all. In a community with a single stoplight, at least 6 churches, and an abundance of backyard shooting ranges, most people believed in God and, just slightly less, in their right to bear arms. Townville sat on the edge of a county in which 7 in 10 voters supported Donald Trump in 2016. Gable-roofed chicken houses stood among cow pastures and rolling fields of hay, wheat, corn, and soybeans, and everyone shopped at Dollar General, nicknamed the Townville Target. It was a world that, in Ava's mind, had always been safe and always would be. That changed one afternoon in late September 2016 when she walked outside her school for recess just as a teenager drove up to the playground in a Dodge Ram, jumped out of the pickup, and pointed a gun. One of the bullets he fired struck 6-year-old Jacob Hall, a classmate whom Ava loved dearly. 3 days later, Jacob died. She was so overwhelmed by the loss and the terror of what she'd witnessed that a pediatrician later diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder and recommended that the girl be homeschooled. Ava, who was prescribed both antipsychotics and antidepressants, began hitting herself and yanking out her eyelashes. In the months that followed, she detailed her tormented journals. "I can't stop feeling mad. No one ever listens to me. I hate guns." By then, Tyshawn, who is black, had known since as far back as his memories stretched about the bad things people could do with guns. On his dad's dresser in Southeast Washington was a reminder, a 3-inch button inscribed with "Rest in Peace" that honored a family friend shot 2 blocks away. Tyshawn was growing up in a time of rapid gentrification across the 700,000-person city. The change had yet to reach his side of the Anacostia River, where more than half the district's homicides occurred. Nearly every other child grew up in poverty. It was amid this chaos that the boy lived part-time with his father, Andrew McFadder, in a row of 70-year-old duplexes around the corner from a liquor store. The vast majority of his overwhelmingly black section of the city rejected Trump in 2016, as did the rest of Washington, which cast just 1 in 25 votes for him. Parents in Tyshawn's neighborhood viewed firearms less like sacred objects than like carriers of an infectious disease. But they were everywhere, despite the district's strict gun laws, thanks to the demand from drug dealers and gang members and a supply from surrounding states with much looser laws. The impact was perpetually devastating on the community, where many boys and girls learned to navigate peril before they learned to read. For kids in Tyshawn's neighborhood, the unrelenting threat of gun violence informed almost every aspect of their lives. The streets they walked down, the parks they visited, the pictures they drew, the nightmares they had, the number of parents they came home to. Tyshawn's mom, Donna Johnson, had fretted since he was born about how that environment would affect her son. So she decided that the best way to keep him safe was to keep him busy. He made s'mores at Cub Scout gatherings and took lessons for hockey, swimming, and software coding. He liked football and decided at a wiry 4'4" that he would play linebacker in the NFL for his home team when he grew up. Donna, a 30-year-old State Department security officer, was desperate to protect his goofy innocence, the quality that led him once to secretly record himself rapping an original song she discovered later. "What are those in your toes? They can't be Doritos," he rhymed, then nodded to the camera, feeling good about his track. That's the new one. She struggled to preserve that piece of her boy, who had both a deep well of compassion for people he sensed were suffering, and a tendency to explode in anger, often with his fists, when he was being teased or challenged. "I just want him to be different," Donna would say, because she had already seen too many tough young boys who, when they turned into tough young men, ended up in prisons or caskets. By age 7, Tyshawn had narrowly escaped harm from gunfire twice, and 3 of his father's friends had already been killed. Then came that week, early in 2017, when, over 7 days, 6 people were shot on a single street that ran through their neighborhood. The last of them, and the only one who didn't survive, was Tyshawn's father. The loss unmoored Tyshawn, whose dad was also his best friend. They were twins, said people who knew Andrew as a boy before the dreadlocks. Same chocolate eyes, strong chin, quiet smile. Andrew was the fun parent, the one who stayed up with Tyshawn well past his bedtime, playing the violent video games Donna didn't like. But Andrew was also the parent who, while Donna worked, attended parent-teacher meetings and seldom missed a school performance or ball game. As the weeks passed and the signs of the boy's sorrow waned, his fear and fury bloomed. At home, he began to talk less of the things he missed about his dad and more about the man who killed him and whether he would come after Tyshawn too. At school, he shoved a boy who he suspected had laughed about the shooting, later threatening to punch another who he thought had done the same. One day, after a long stretch of quiet during a drive home, he told his mom he wanted to die so he could be with his dad again. Tyshawn McPhatter didn't get shot, and neither did Ava Olson. Their small bodies bear none of the grisly physical wounds that our nation assumes to be the direst consequence of gun violence. But the damage that bullets did to both of them was immense. Their experiences as young Americans were not in any way unique, though. Every moment of every day, gunfire reshapes our kids' lives because of whom it takes away or what it makes them witness or how it forever changes their view of the world. And time after time, the people who love them wondered the same thing that the people who loved Tyshawn and Ava wondered about them. Would these children ever recover?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. The book continues with John telling us a firsthand experience with both Tyshawn and Ava of what their lives are like and how they're dealing with the normal stuff that kids deal with and then the extraordinary stuff that they have been forced to deal with, and their relationship with each other, which is a very interesting part of the book because what they have in common is their trauma.
Right.
John, you're certainly receiving a lot of attention, both for the series. You are a Pulitzer Prize finalist for the series of feature articles, and now the book is commanding a lot of attention. But it seems like there's more to it than that for you. Several times in the book, you mention about how you had been trained as a journalist to stay out of the story, to not become part of the story. But with you more or less embedded with these families, there were times when that would have been really difficult, if not impossible. Can you tell us a little about those situations?
Sure. Yeah, there were a couple of instances where, maintaining that distance that really you're trying so hard to maintain as an observer, where that really became difficult. There was one moment in particular on the morning of Tyshawn's father's funeral, where I was in his room as he's getting ready, and he had picked out an outfit. He'd found this outfit that was based on what his dad wore to a dance when he was in 8th grade, and he had this silver vest and it was black, and he just said, well, that's what I want to wear. So that morning, I'm in the room, and Tyshawn's putting his clothes on, and he'd never put a tie on before in his life, and he had a clip-on tie, and he didn't know how to put it on. And I'm the only adult in sort of immediate proximity, and he looks up at me and says, "Can you help me put my tie on?" And instinctively, as a journalist, you just work so hard. You're trained over so many years to maintain that distance, right? And not what we call sort of influence the scene or influence a moment, but sort of in a split second, the reality of his situation just struck me so hard that he's never put on a tie, and it's sort of a rite of passage in this country, at least, that your father teaches you how to put your tie on, and his father's gone, and he's putting this tie on to go to his father's funeral, right, and to say goodbye. And so I put my notebook under my arm and walked over and helped him, showed him how to put it on. And it was one of those moments where you just have to. I always say that it's our job to be human first as a journalist. That's job one before you're a journalist. And that was a moment where this is the worst day, one of the worst days of his life, and I was just going to do that and live with it. I think it would have been a lot harder to live with not doing it. So, that was certainly one moment where I struggled to maintain that strict barrier. And then another with Ava. So Ava suffers from really debilitating trauma and has these violent outbursts sometimes as a result of her trauma. And I had witnessed one, and I was spent many weeks in South Carolina with her family, and I'd witnessed one of these that lasted about 45 minutes. It was really one of the more shocking, disturbing things I've ever seen in my career. And I knew I was going to use that scene in the book. And then later that same week, when I was there, I could see another one was sort of beginning. And I so badly didn't want it to happen. And I thought, Ava's doctors will say that what she goes through is a disassociation, is that she will sort of disconnect. And later she'll often say that she doesn't remember what's happened. And so I thought, maybe if in this moment when I see her when it's building and it's about to explode, I thought, well, maybe if she sort of sees me, acknowledges my presence here, then it'll sort of shake her out of this. And so I tried to address her. I remember she was standing on the couch. This is not something I would normally do, but I just badly didn't want her to go through this again, and I didn't want her parents to go through it again. And so I said something to her, and she looked right through me. I mean, it was like I was not even there. She just, and it still happened. Those were a couple of moments when I just felt like, if I can do something for these kids, then I'm just going to do it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. You are also human.
Right.
And I understand the concept as a pastor, the concept of professional distance.
Right.
While that's important, there certainly are moments when,
right.
when the compassion needs to be present.
Right.
Well, in the book, you move so effectively from these very intimate moments with these two families into the larger issues surrounding gun violence. I remember you mentioning in one chapter that it's estimated that 240,000 children have been in school buildings where at the time that there had been a school shooting since Columbine High School. Right. And the numbers are certainly greater than that 240,000 if you include after school activities or neighborhoods around school before and after school, but at least 240,000. And then I moved from that into what I refer to as chapter 13, which was about school security.
Right.
And about this multi-billion-dollar industry that has been building around school shootings. And it reminded me very much of when we who are gun violence prevention activists, when we hear our political leaders saying, offering their thoughts and prayers, but then doing absolutely nothing to address the issue of the gun.
Right.
It seemed to me that this multi-billion-dollar industry being built around school security is going out of its way to not say anything about the guns brought into schools. How was that for you doing that research while you are also dealing with the trauma of these kids?
Yeah, that was frustrating and infuriating in many ways. That, it begins with this idea that societally, politically, we've put the onus on schools, where we've said, schools, this is your problem to fix, which is totally unreasonable and unrealistic. So schools, in acts of desperation, they're not security experts. They're not, they're educators. And so they've turned to this industry that has sprung up. There's all this demand, and it, begins with parents desperate Also, if they can't convince their politicians to change any laws, then they go to the schools and say, schools, what are you doing to prevent Parkland from happening at our school? So the principals and superintendents have all this pressure on them. So then they, go out into the world and try to find something out there, right? And so it has sprung up this, multi-billion-dollar industry, and based entirely on sort of smoke and mirrors, really. I mean, there is no evidence backing almost any of these security measures that have become so popular. So I saw things like bulletproof backpacks being sold at Walmart, and these doors. The people had developed these doors that would theoretically go in front of every single classroom that could stop somebody with an AK-47 from shooting through the door. And they said, it could identify where the shooter is standing. And there was this other idea this guy had, this former Special Forces guy who wanted to embed Special Forces agents in schools because they were better at shooting attackers than police officers were, and that they could infiltrate the troubled groups, and just all of these really outlandish ideas. And the thing that I found most frustrating, beyond the obvious, which is why we're not starting with the problem, right? Which is, okay, how are the guns getting in the schools? Why are these guns totally unregulated? How are children getting access to so many guns, and why aren't we making any effort to stop that? But also just the fact that I'm sure that there are some number of ideas around school security that are good and effective, but we have not researched it at all. So we're spending billions and billions of dollars every year on all this stuff that is just not backed by any evidence at all. I mean, there was cases of one school gave all their students rocks, and they said, when the gunman comes into your school, throw the rocks at the gunman. We're going to stone the gunman. I mean, it's just like mind-boggling that in this day and age, that's where we are. So, I found plenty of people who I think were just trying to take advantage of the fear. Mm-hmm. There was one woman I remember specifically at the school conference. I went to the school safety conference in Orlando. That's a lot of that chapter's about that. And there's a moment where this woman who had come there to sell tourniquets to schools, and she tells, sort of bragging to me about how she knelt down and had a 6-year-old put the tourniquet on her. And she was making the case to me, like, see how effective our product is, that even a 6-year-old could put it on. And it was like, not until I pointed out to these people that, for their industry to survive, they need children to continue to get murdered in schools. Not until I sort of pointed that out did the giddiness about, all the money they were going to make from this, did it kind of ebb a bit. But, it's really infuriating that's where we are. I don't blame the schools. They're desperate to do something, and they're also feeling an enormous amount of pressure from parents. But it just shouldn't be on them. This epidemic will never end if we're leaving it in the hands of schools. It's just totally unrealistic.
Absolutely. And if we always make the argument that the answer is more guns, we will never reduce gun violence, because if the answer was more guns, we would have been there a long time ago. We don't know how many guns there are in our country, but it's quite likely that they outnumber the number of people that we have in our country. So the answer is not more guns. We deal with much the same issue in faith communities, where faith communities are wanting to keep their people safe while they're there, but without addressing the issue of the number of guns in our country, no solution, especially a solution that involves more guns, is going to be effective.
Right.
You mentioned also, and it was interesting to me, because we involve ourselves in a lot of research for the work that we do, that you were naming the same entities that we would use: Giffords Law Center, the CDC. the AFT, but you also make a very strong argument that there's just not enough research. There's not enough government-funded research, that we'll never get to where we need to be until there is.
Right.
Speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. So this is, I think, the thing that has set us back more than anything else in this country on this issue of guns. In the 1990s, a congressman from Arkansas named Jay Dickey proposed a now infamous amendment it's become known as the Dickey Amendment, and he was pushed by the NRA to do this, and basically it was one line in a spending bill saying that the CDC wouldn't use funds, taxpayer money, to promote gun control. That's sort of a short version of it, and that had such a chilling effect on research that we've basically done none. We didn't do any for about 25 years. We didn't do any research, which, Dickey said even at the time that wasn't really his intent, but that was certainly the result. And it would be not unlike if, let's say, in May of last year, as the pandemic was exploding, that a few members of Congress said, we don't like the politics of the research. We don't like how the research around COVID is going. So we're just not going to study it. It would be the equivalent. I mean, the 1990s was at the very height of the gun violence epidemic in this country, and we just stopped looking into it. We just stopped researching the causes, how to stop it, all of that gone. Not until the last year or two has the government finally committed some money back to that again. But, we can't know how to cure cancer, how to stop COVID, how to develop a vaccine, how to stop guns from killing children or their parents without researching it. And, we would have made, if you consider 25 years of research, what we could have done and the progress we could have made. And it's not about depriving people of their guns. I mean, there would be all sorts of solutions that we hadn't even considered. And for me, what was revelatory is the RAND Corporation did this review of every major gun policy in America. And their standards were, you have to have a certain amount of research for them to make a determination. Does this policy work? Does it help? Does it not work? Mm-hmm. And if you go on that list, almost every one of them says inconclusive. They don't know. The RAND Corporation couldn't say definitively what would work and what wouldn't work. And what's so infuriating is that is by design. That was a plot from the gun lobbyists, where they believe you can either have your guns or you can have research. You can't have both. And, to Jay Dickey's credit, he had a change of heart. He realized that he'd made a huge mistake and campaigned for the last several years of his life for gun research. And a thing that, for him, changed his mind was the little 3-foot barriers on the highway. So that, he's driving down the road and he looks over and sees these barriers, which all of us, they're invisible to all of us now, but those have saved tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. And I often use car safety as a really good analogy. There was a time when nobody in this country wanted to wear seatbelts. Like 90% plus of Americans did not want to wear seatbelts. Well, we all do now, and that saves hundreds of thousands of lives. Mm-hmm. The car industry pushed back hard against any kind of regulations. They didn't want to do it because they knew it would cost money. Well, cars at that time, per capita, were killing way more people than they're killing today. And that's because of research. We've realized what works and what doesn't. We could do the exact same thing with guns. And much of the book, makes that case, that this is not unsolvable, but it takes effort. We can't know how to fix it if we make no effort to find out.
Mm-hmm. So much of your book and the answer you just gave, so much of the time I found myself just, nodding along in agreement with you, because this is information that we've gathered, that we're aware of. And but what I really hope for many people who will now read your book is that maybe they aren't aware of all of that. And I truly believe that once we are aware of the extent of the issue of gun violence. I mean, it's 109 people will be killed today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day. That once they become aware of the extent, that then they will move from a simple awareness into advocacy, and then into activism. And that's how our organization, God Before Guns, works, is to move people into awareness first and then into stronger advocacy. And we've certainly learned over the last several years in doing this work that gun violence prevention work is not for the faint of heart or anyone who's looking for a quick fix, quick solutions. But we know that we're in this for the long haul, because we're working on changing hearts, and we know that takes time. So after you have spent now several years immersed in this issue, what are you hopeful about? What do you think can realistically be done?
Well, I think the fact that there's an administration now that acknowledges the crisis, right? You know, when you talked about awareness, I feel like that's such a big piece of this. Is there are tens of millions, if not maybe 100 million plus people in this country who either intentionally or through ignorance don't accept the scope of this crisis, right? They are dismissive about things like suicide, right? Where they'll say that, oh, you can't count suicide. If someone's going to kill themselves, they're going to do it no matter what. That's fundamentally untrue. You know, access to a gun makes you many, many, many times more likely to die by suicide. But, you know, even beyond so 43,000 plus people died last year from a shooting. But the reality is that the scope is so much larger, right? The scope of this crisis is so much bigger than that. Even if that's a horrifying number. 43,000 is a horrifying number. But, you know, I often cite the chapter in the book about lockdowns, for example, where I know that somewhere between 4 and 8 million children a year in a normal school year go through a lockdown, an actual lockdown, not just a lockdown drill, but an actual lockdown. The vast majority of those are caused by the threat of gun violence. And a meaningful percentage of those kids think in that moment of that lockdown that they're going to die in their school in a shooting. So let's say, you know, 1% of 8 million kids. That is a huge number of children who are being indirectly traumatized by this epidemic, right? So that's one way that I always think when I try to explain to people, well, 43,000 is bad, but that doesn't begin to illustrate the scope. You know, of those 43,000, how many of those people had children? You know, tens of thousands of them had kids who are now left without a parent because of a gun, right? So I think it begins with that, and I am hopeful, and I think that, you know, one thing people always want to say that, well, you know, Sandy Hook didn't change anything. That's fundamentally untrue. Right. You know, Wear Orange didn't exist, right? I mean, there are things that so many organizations, Moms Demand did not exist before Sandy Hook. People often think that a lot of these organizations, you know, were founded after Columbine, and that's just not true. Sandy Hook was the moment that so many of these organizations came online, and now you could argue that their power is as extensive, if not more extensive, than the NRA's, you know, and there's been one voice really for a long, long time on the issue of gun legislation and gun violence, and that's been the NRA, and that is no longer true. So it is a long game. I think especially at the federal level, the states have made, I think, considerable more progress on, you know, gun regulation and what people would call common sense gun regulation. You know, I wrote the book and made these sort of suggestions, these core suggestions on things that I thought were attainable and that would directly impact kids' lives. So, you know, in the epilogue of the book, I often get asked this question, right, is what could make the biggest difference? And I didn't want to sort of offer recommendations that I thought would be really partisan or that would split people on this issue. So the three things, that I recommended, one is research, which I think any reasonable person should argue that we should know more about this epidemic and why it does what it does and what we can do to stop it. The second that I think that would make a really significant difference for kids is universal background checks. This is a thing that 90% of Americans in many polls back, including an overwhelming majority of gun owners. And then the third is safe storage laws. And these are laws that basically say, hey, if you have a gun, you have to prevent a child from getting access to it. That doesn't mean, if you want to go buy 15 AR-15s, you can still do that. You just have to keep a child from getting access to those guns, right? So these are laws that don't prohibit people from owning, buying guns. It just says you have to be responsible with your deadly weapon. Maybe the only thing that I think all Americans care about as it relates to guns and kids is school shootings. So, what I always cite when I talk about safe storage laws, and this is from my own research. I've researched every school shooting dating back to Columbine. And if children did not have access to guns, more than half the school shootings in the last 2 decades would not have happened. It's that simple. I mean, that to me is, if you don't care about suicide, if you don't care about kids getting guns and shooting their siblings or themselves or their parents, at least this, right? We could stop more than half of the school shootings if children simply did not have access to firearms overnight, right? And that's worth doing. So, and I think those laws are attainable. I think there are things that, again, the vast majority of people agree on. And, I think, though, that a lot of it will probably have to happen at the state level. I think that overcoming the filibuster, that's really what it comes down to in the Senate. It is like 4 or 5 people are going to decide whether this country has new gun laws or not. And it's 4 or 5 senators, and they're going to have to make a decision. Am I more afraid of the wrath of the NRA, or am I more afraid of, the gun safety groups and Moms Demand and Giffords and those folks? And I think at this stage, they're probably more afraid of the gun lobbyists still in those more conservative states, even if their constituents back these laws, which many of them do.
Right. Well, it's you are right when you point to, in many places in your book, where this side of the argument has mobilized, and through a lot of grassroots organizing,
right,
through the organizations you've mentioned and organizations like ours, where there are differences now, and we are talking about the issue now. And that wasn't the case when we formed in 2013. So there are signs of hope, but it certainly is it's not going to be solved tomorrow.
Right.
But I thank you so much for your book, because I know at our organization we are doing this work for many reasons, but first and foremost, so our children will be able to grow up. And that's coming from people of all faiths who want their children to grow to adulthood. And you do such a fine job in your book of not just talking about mass shootings or school shootings, but shootings that happen in neighborhoods every single day, like affected Tyshawn when his father was killed. And in order to make a difference, we're going to have to realize that it's about that daily toll, and it's also about the mass shootings in public places.
Yeah.
And through the eyes of children was a view that we hadn't read previously. And we have that in Children Under Fire. And we're going to put a slide up at the end of this interview, and we want to encourage people to buy the book, Children Under Fire, An American Crisis, John Woodrow Cox, newly published. And it will touch your heart in so many ways, and also make you so aware of the issue of gun violence and what you can do to make a difference. Thank you so much, John, for your dedication to this, and thank you for spending this time with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.